Because this is the first time Africa is coming as one to talk about climate change financing and how to sustainably build our continent and mitigate against the risks that have come through because of climate change. And the delegates out there are saying we are happy. In fact, I did speak to one envoy from Sweden who was very happy with President Ruto's speech, saying that that is the way to go. That if Africa continues with this trajectory of one voice, we'll be able to haggle for ourselves globally very well and articulately.
Then also this brings a question, where does this leave or lead, the operationalization of the loss and damage fund that, was a decision made during the COP27 in Egypt? I guess this is a question that is going to be answered come Wednesday. Another issue that came up during the first sessions of the morning was the issue of carbon credits and expanding the market, looking at, the African context. We saw the UAE there, $450 million into this particular market. What do you think is going to be the ripple effect when it comes to carbon credit trading, especially for Africa, with that particular endorsement and funding, so to speak?
Just to rope in our viewers from where this all began, it was launched at COP27 in Egypt with the aim of, scaling voluntary carbon markets across Africa. And the African Carbon Markets Initiative was created to scale the market up to 300 million carbon credits, which is now required annually, which is actually retired rather, annually by 2030. And of course, that's 1.5 billion credits annually by 2050. And the morning's session was very interesting, where we had the climate envoy from the United States, yes, John Kerry, yes, come in and tell Africa that, this is a very good initiative. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement speaks to this. What we need to do is to come collectively and haggle about the carbon pricing and carbon credits.
Yes.
But of course, you see, there are proponents also who are saying that maybe carbon credits is not the way to go because the pricing is too low. However, Mr. Kerry was saying that, there's fears that maybe these companies that are trying to offset this using carbon credits are going to use the funds to continue destroying the environment. But he was suggesting that, look, let us do this with companies that are actually, for example, are going to stop using coal, shut down coal power plants, just to make sure that this is not a hoax or that the money is diverted for other things.
Yeah. Another issue some of the stakeholders, the civil rights activist group raised, is that when it comes to the value of carbon credits within Africa, it's still very low. Yet, if you compare it to other parts of, the globe, actually it's worth something. So then how do we incentivize Africa to get into carbon credits and carbon credit stocks and such? And this is a conversation that is still going to go on. Remember, we have 2 more days of this particular conference here, that is in the inaugural one in Africa, and these are some of the issues that have been raised that are very pertinent, matters of why is Africa lagging behind when it comes to getting onto the bandwagon that is climate centricity. Now also let's talk about matters of why isn't Africa seemingly tapping into the international climate funding options that are out there. And I'd want to take you, Alan, back to the conversation we had this morning with Dr. Oldman Koboto, who's the manager of the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. And he pointed out 2 things, and I'd want to pick your brain on this. That Africa in general lacks the technical capacity to have projects rolled out that meet the international market standards. Another one is competing interests by various states or governments who are keenly focusing on developing the fossil fuel industry to the detriment of clean energy. From what you have heard since morning, have these issues actually been tackled by the various panels?
Well, from what we've seen from the panels, we've seen at least, wow, it's very interesting that you should say that, because the African continent is finally coming as one, and you find the talk of one voice is larger, because, for example, in Malawi, in Mozambique, we've had the issues of tornadoes and rising sea levels. And when we speak to proponents from those areas, they are saying, we've been trying to talk about this carbon pricing and how to champion for financing to mitigate against this risk, but it has been a bit of a challenge. But now that we've heard that there's a summit and we are coming together, we want to see if we can address the people across the room. Global representatives are here. I'm sure you've also seen them around in the exhibition side. They're here representing the organizations from around the world, and they're happy that they can sit across from them and tell them, look, we have this challenge, and in fact, financing for climate adaptation efforts is tedious. When you go to the when you go to bring your documents to the table, it's a long and lengthy process.
Yes.
And they're saying, no, this can't happen. There needs to be speed in this because the climate change is here already. We cannot wait until a further 10 years for us to mitigate against this. And we are seeing the conversation has begun. And if you follow the panels and sessions closely, you'll realize that it's a kind of a question and answer situation where you get to get your answer immediately so that at least you iron out the issues that have been pending from the previous COPs. Because I'm sure, and you've heard from the panels, they don't want another declaration that will not also be followed up going into the next summit. Yes.
Now, last but not least was a conversation around food systems, and that was actually moderated by the Vice Chair of AGRA, that is Asiwe Konde Agi, who came out and said that, increased investments in agri-food systems are critical to realizing the ambitions of the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement. However, there are some issues that were raised when it comes to matters of why aren't we investing fully in food systems? And one of the issues was lack of access to finance, especially to smallholder farmers across the continent. Looking at our Kenyan situation in itself, 80% of farmers in Kenya are under the smallholder category, yet access to credit is a problem. Do you think, Alan, this push and this focus to having, governments being challenged to put in more investments into smallholder farmers is actually going to change and bring out, reliable and suitable, food systems for food security and also prosperity?
Yes, that's a very good question. And when it comes to smallholder farmers, you yourself, you've been across the country, you've met them as we do our features every time here on KBC Channel 1. We try to showcase the social impact of these farmers on the ground. And each time you go, you find that they have an issue, one or two issues, or even several about climate change. And we ask them, how are you accessing climate mitigation financing to help you grow your farm, to help you take your food to market, and good food, not just any kind of food. And they tell us there's an issue. They tell us that the kind of collective agreements that they must have as farmers is really difficult. That they must band together. And we even ask on the organizational sides, the development partners, they tell us that these farmers need to come together, not as one. Come together with one voice so that you can be able to ask for these mitigation measures. Yes.
Well, that's just but an executive summary of day one of the Africa Climate Summit that is currently underway at KICC. We're going to be keeping tabs here for the next 2-3 days to look at what impact the Nairobi Declaration is going to have on Kenya and on Africa at large, especially ahead of the COP28 that is upcoming in November. I'm Regina Manyara.
And I'm Alan Oko.
So do keep watching. This is the ACS Summit 2023.
With you this afternoon. So I'm Franny Leotier, and I'm a senior partner at Southbridge Group and the CEO of Southbridge Investments, but I also chair FSD Africa Board. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to moderate this panel. Let me first thank you. It's been a long day, and I see the audience, you are numerous and still excited and alert, so thank you. First of all, for being here. Secondly, for choosing this particular panel because you have many other options to go to. We're very grateful to you. And let me now welcome the first group of panelists to the stage. And I will call on them. Some of them are still on their way in from other sessions, so If you don't see them coming up, they will come on later. We first have Honorable Susanna Mohammed, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. I hope she's already arrived or she's on her way. Then we have Dr. Pepukai Bardui. Pep. Right, Minister, welcome. Dr. Pepukai Bardui. Hi, Pep. She's Director, Bridgetown Initiative and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Climate Resilience, Barbados. Please welcome. Then we have Director Kurt Vandenberg. He's Director General in the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate, cutely known as DG Klima, and so the man in charge of the European Green Deal transformation plan. And then my very good friend, the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell, Member of Parliament, Minister of State in the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the UK's Minister for Development and for Africa. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are most welcome. Before we start our discussion, let me briefly explain why we are having this conversation and what you can expect to hear in the 90 minutes. We hope to keep you entertained. The core issue here is that there isn't nearly enough climate finance at work in Africa. We've heard since this morning how important it is, nature finance, climate finance, but there isn't enough. And the contribution from the domestic private sector and the domestic financial sector in particular isn't much, but it's much too low for what the continent needs. So just to give you some figures, you may have heard this or read them in other reports before. Total climate finance in Africa today stands at about $30 billion, and 85% of that comes from outside Africa. And that creates a dependency that Africa does not want, and it exposes Africa to the volatility in global financial markets, exchange rate risks. I heard today that the new risk to be covered over and above country risk is exchange rate risk, and other risks. So what this panel is about to discuss is ways of reducing and perhaps eliminating this dependency and vulnerability, and making Africa's growth and development more resilient, and allowing its leaders to have more control over the economic destiny of their countries. Well-functioning domestic financial markets are a fundamentally important part of this vision. With the right incentives, they can be the engine that drives growth. They can provide the spark that ignites innovation. We want domestic financial institutions to be the ones to get behind successful models of innovation and scale these up, which is essential if Africa is to achieve a just and green transition. But the brutal reality is that domestic private financial firms are only playing a marginal role at the moment. Today, in the panel that just ended, I was one out of 12 speakers from the private sector financial industry. So research from the Climate Policy Initiative funded by FSD Africa shows that only 3% of total climate finance in Africa, so that's about $830 million out of this 30 billion that I mentioned, comes from African financial institutions. And yet, collectively, African sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and other institutional investors have an estimated $1.4 trillion in assets under management. So with this panel, we hope to pinpoint some of the practical ways African financial market leaders can intervene to strengthen innovation, boost competitiveness, and drive a large-scale increase in climate and nature-positive investment. We'll carry out the conversation in this session in 3 sequential discussions. The first discussion, which I will moderate, focuses on policy and regulation, where we are already seeing a lot more facilitative policy and regulatory environment for green finance than in the past. The second section focuses on instruments and financial infrastructure, the conduits for green finance. So the question we're asking there is the right engineering in place to allow the capital to flow to where it's needed. And then the last section focuses on project preparation. Everybody complains there's no pipeline, there are resources but no pipeline, so this session will focus on that and what we need to do to create projects that can absorb much larger volumes of capital. Before closing, I want to suggest that we are in fact on the right track. Right up and down the finance value chain and in the policy-making environment, there's been some very significant innovation. We need to recognize this and lock it in. But I'm sure we can all agree that much, much more is needed. So with those brief opening remarks, let me now turn to Madame Susanna, Minister Susanna Mohammed, Honorable Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. As we speak, your country is hosting the Finance in Common Summit, where when you look at the themes in that summit, they're really focused on climate and nature finance and innovations on how the world can tackle these problems. So I'm very grateful that you left that very important forum to come here. So let me ask you, first I salute Colombia for that and its leadership and commitment to that summit. So what can you share with us today in terms of the wider objectives of financing climate and nature and what your country has done and that the rest of us, particularly in Africa, can take away from? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. From President Gustavo Petro, it was very important for us as Colombia to be here in the African Union Summit on Climate, because we think that we are facing a similar challenge in financing climate within the South countries. For us, this challenge is called debt. Foreign debt is eating part of our fiscal space to be able to finance the very needed adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damages that we are already suffering all around the world. It is a very unjust system where we as more vulnerable countries face the difficulty of accessing more expensive capital. And the more that climate change hits our countries with disasters, the more our grades in the international financial system go down and our access to capital is more expensive. 71% currently of financing for climate mitigation comes through debt, and very few is actually coming to adaptation. And the answer in some of these meetings is that private sector financing will be the one helping us to fill that gap of finance. From Colombia, we don't believe that to be truth because of a simple reason. Private money will go where there is profitability. And when you have whole population in need to adaptation, or where you need to recover ecosystems, or where you need to attend humanitarian crisis caused by climate change, this is not profitable. The planning processes and the structural adaptation processes in our country not necessarily are profitable. If we leave financing to that profitability criteria only, we will leave millions of people in the frontiers, in the first lines of climate change. And we have as states a very big responsibility. So our answer is actually to strengthen the public sector and the capacity of governments multilaterally to plan this climate transition process. How do we do that? What can be some one or two answers that we are putting forward for discussion? First, we think we need to see climate as an emergency. similar of how we saw COVID as an emergency. Because we only have 7 years to reach the Paris Agreement goals, which means shifting whole systems of society in a very short time. Similarly, when you needed to react in a very short time to a health crisis. If we define that climate is an emergency and needs to be addressed as such now, we suggest that the IMF, and this is where we come to some structural proposals, use SDR, special drawing rights, similarly to how they did it in COVID. There is an unfair system there as well, because who can access more SDRs are the countries that have more GDP, which means countries that are better able to actually adapt to climate and mitigate climate are the ones that have more access to lower capital and to SDRs. We propose to change that in the IMF, and that the SDR's rights can be accessed in a combination of evaluation between vulnerability to climate and GDP. And that we create a guarantee fund where we put developed countries SDRs, they have more SDRs that they need, and developing countries and medium rent countries SDRs into something like a guarantee fund. This guarantee fund will be used by countries to increase their ratings of debt to AAA quality all around the world, so that we can refinance our debt and put interest rates down. For example, in Colombia, we are paying 33% interest rates. Just the debt between 2023 and 2024 budget increasing 30%. If we can create such mechanism, our debt and our negotiation with private and multilateral creditors should bring our interest rate to 3%. And we can make a pact, a global pact. It's a political pact, not a market pact. It's a political pact where we together put those interest rates for 10 years in a stable way, and that allows a country such as Colombia to use that before we have to pay every year to foreign debt, to use it for climate action. That will give us concrete access into our financial budgets from the state, a fiscal space that would allow us systematically for 10 years to invest in our commitments. But we could also bring that extra money to create regional game-changing climate projects. For example, what we have done in South America with the 8 Amazon countries coming with a plan to save the Amazon basin. But we also could, for example, think how we can eliminate landfills so that we stop emissions of methane from waste. Or we could think about what we are proposing in South America, an electric line between Alaska to Patagonia that allow us to fill it with renewable energy, and we help the United States to decarbonize. This type of game-changing projects in 10 years with fiscal space and real flows of money, I think will allow us to make a difference rather than continuously thinking that having more debt to finance climate or the private sector money will help us to solve this crisis where we don't have any more time.
All right, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. You raised 2 really critical points, the role of the private sector, innovations like SDR, but you focused on concrete examples of your own domestic solutions to solve the problem. So it gives me an opportunity now to turn to Dr. Pep. You took leave from the World Bank to go and do something really critical, which is advise the Prime Minister of Barbados on climate issues, but also to be the director of the Bridgetown Initiative. Now, the Bridgetown Initiative has been well received as a focus on reforming the global financial architecture. And some have argued that it really doesn't talk much about the private sector and domestic financing in particular. So what would you say about that? What's the role of domestic capital in the private sector within the Bridgetown Initiative?
Thank you.
Okay, that should be working. Thank you. And always difficult to follow a passionate speaker, so thank you for your comments. I think fundamentally the thought process behind the Bridgetown Initiative is that we need a huge amount of capital increase from multiple directions. The private sector is certainly part of that. There is a specific piece within Bridgetown that speaks about catalyzing $1.5 trillion in private financing. But the approach or the mechanism is through the public sector. That is not the only way to catalyze private finance, but within Bridgetown, I think we see it as one of the key approaches. The reality is that we're on the continent of Africa, which has resources that can attract private financing through carbon credits, right? There are other mechanisms. If you think about small island developing states, which are essentially large ocean states, blue carbon is not yet there, but needs to get to a point where it's providing significant resources. But if I think about the domestic private sector, the reality is that when we talk about the need to catalyze, sorry, let me know if there's feedback, to catalyze that $1.5 or $2 trillion annually in private financing, much of it needs to come from domestic markets. One of the major challenges that has been raised on this platform, both in the plenary and in many of the side events and parallel sessions, is project development financing. I know that you're going to come to that point, Franny, a little bit later. But the reality is that even if we get past the hurdle of developing high-quality projects, de-risking those projects, what has been spoken about again and again is both the real and perceived risk that then affects the interest rates. And those are interest rates for foreign exchange. If we are looking at domestic money, which needs to come to the table, we need to develop deep and rich domestic private capital markets. We can look at the rate of growth of renewable energy projects in India, which is potentially transformative. The bottleneck there is not the lack of projects, it's the lack of depth in domestic private markets. So fundamentally, that needs to be a piece of the solution or piece of the puzzle, particularly in the larger countries where you need large amounts of resources. But again, because I have both a Bridgetown hat and a Barbados hat, let me speak a little bit about the Barbados market. Barbados, again, is a very small country. For those who just heard me speak at the V20 session, it's extremely tiny. It's 300,000 people, but I'm actually from Dominica, which is 70,000 people, so much smaller. But the reality is that many of these even small countries have very liquid capital markets. You mentioned that I'm on external service from the World Bank Group. Specifically, I'm on external service from the International Finance Corporation, so the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And we've found, with my IFC hat, that in many countries, particularly in Eastern Caribbean countries which have highly liquid markets, international or foreign capital is not as competitive as domestic capital. The problem in domestic markets is threefold. Firstly, it's cultural. In small countries that do not have a tradition of investing in infrastructure, because that infrastructure was already there in pre-colonial times, say the water sector or power projects had been developed 50, 60, 70 years ago under the colonial era, there isn't a tradition, number one. Number two, for project developers that are looking for larger projects, the markets are very small. So often you find developers from markets that are liquid going to other markets that are just larger and taking their capital externally. And I think, the third concern is that there are very few large enterprises that are considered bankable or credit-worthy. In the context of Barbados, the national power company, Barbados Light and Power, is highly credit-worthy. It's a highly functioning utility, 6-7% power losses. It's really quite exceptional. But domestic banks are maxed out on their ability to lend to that entity. So where else are they going to put their money? Perversely, in liquid markets, the domestic private sector and the small liquid markets has the same challenge as the international private sector, which is limited pipeline or insufficient diversification. So how then do you get them to diversify that money that's sitting in bank accounts looking for a home into projects in the resilience space, right? There may not be enough projects in mitigation, there may not be enough hotel projects, but there are definitely projects in the resilience space. And this is where I think we need to look at leveraging public financing. Many of those projects do not have either a revenue stream or a sufficiently large revenue stream. but they do, over time, provide tremendous economic value. So how do you then bring that domestic capital into solving the roads problem? You may not be able to build a toll road in many of our smaller countries. There's a beautiful new toll road in Nairobi, which I understand is on track to deliver on its revenue projections, or even exceeding them, which is exceptional. But in a market of 70 to 300,000 people, toll roads are going to have limited performance. That doesn't mean that you cannot mobilize that capital into a resilience bond that looks at nature-based solutions, coral reef regeneration, mangrove protection, potentially even looking at swapping out certain parts of the water mains in the country that generally are difficult to do with private capital, but with the right amount of either viability gap financing or de-risking, you can leverage that private financing. Barbados has done some very interesting things to bring the private capital that exists into renewable energy projects by attracting domestic participation into small-scale renewable projects. Much of that is industrial solar projects, it could be rooftop solar projects, but much more can be done outside of the energy space, and it's certainly something that we're beginning to look at now.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. You raised two things that struck me. The first one being how small economies, like island economies, but other small economies, could actually leverage the global financial markets to meet environment and climate nature objectives in their economies through a better structuring of how you make the offer. And then the second one, which is equally important, is that the Bridgetown Initiative actually does have room for the private sector and for domestic capital in general. So thank you for that. So Kurt, let me turn to you. We have been watching and very interested in seeing the development of the sustainable finance framework in the European Union. And we hear that the European Commission has appointed a high-level expert group on sustainable finance to provide inputs into the new strategy that the EU is developing that would help intervene in private financial flows for the SDGs. So first of all, we are curious, how is this process going? Do you envisage that this will eventually result in mobilizing the additional financial resources we've all been talking about here for the kind of interventions this panel has been discussing? And if you would, what would be the role or could be the role of the EU in supporting Africa and other countries to develop their domestic financial markets?
Thank you very much. Very, very happy and privileged to be here. We commend the African Union, the Kenyan government, and President Ruto for convening this African Climate Summit and to really put Africa on the forefront of the solutions to climate change. I would like to pick up from the Colombian minister when you said we face a climate emergency. That is absolutely true. We are in a critical decade where we need to reduce emissions by 43% globally if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is sticking to 1.5 degree maximum warming. It's also a critical decade for the development and the fight against poverty in Africa. And the two very much go together. And what my proposition here today is that actually the global climate agenda is an agenda, a strategy for growth, for innovation, for investment. That's what we are doing in the European Union with the European Green Deal, which we are developing and implementing as a growth and investment strategy, because we know that a growth model based on fossil fuels, based on wasted of resources, based on environmental degradation has no future. We need a new form of growth. We have agreed with 27 countries democratically that we will reduce our carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions actually, by at least 55% by 2030. And that requires massive investment in Europe. We estimate that we will need to get there, mobilize at least 700 billion euros additional investment per year up to 2030 to achieve this, because we are so locked in a fossil fuel-based system. So we need to mobilize and steer and direct investment, both public and private investment. And that is what we're trying to do through the sustainable finance strategy. Now, this needs to happen at global level. We really need a reform of the global financial system or architecture. And that's actually very much spelled out in the Paris Agreement, which says that we should align all financial flows in accordance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I really would like to commend Barbados for the Bridgetown agenda, which really has kicked that agenda very high on the attention of our political leaders. We need to work on this at all levels, national, regional, and global. Now, we from Europe would like to welcome the growing interest that we see in carbon pricing globally. In Europe, we are realizing our reduction of emissions in great part thanks to the emission trading system. It is what I would call the workhorse of our climate agenda in Europe. We have achieved in the sectors that are subject to ETS emission reductions of 37% since 2005. And in the last 10 years only, the ETS system has generated 152 billion euros of revenues, which we reinvest in industrial innovation, in social policies, and indeed in climate finance to help the rest of the world, especially the least developed countries. We are ready to share that experience, both in how you can use it to reduce emissions and generate revenues to reinvest in your clean energy system, in your green industrialization agenda. And that's why President von der Leyen, who will be talking to this in the plenary session tomorrow morning, has launched at the Paris Summit on the global financial architecture, a call to action for Paris-aligned carbon markets, with the idea of promoting the expansion and deepening of domestic carbon markets, which also Kenya is now doing and others in Africa, to support the full implementation of the agreed Article 6 rulebook for international compliance markets, and indeed to ensure high integrity in voluntary carbon markets. We would love to see African countries join this call for action, because Africa can be a big and very convincing advocate towards the major emitters in the world to adopt this carbon pricing. But it will also send a signal, a very important signal to the market, that policy frameworks will be based on the right conditions for integrity in carbon markets, and so that there is sharing of benefits with the local communities. That is very important as a condition for carbon markets. Now, all this goes hand in hand with the development of sustainable finance tools and frameworks, such as green taxonomy, disclosure rules for the financial sector, for the corporate sector, but also green bonds, green standards, labels, and many other of these tools, which we in the EU have developed. We continue to develop them, and we find it very encouraging to see that more and more countries in the north and in the south are putting in place such tools. South Africa, for example, has introduced a green finance taxonomy last year, not exactly the same like the European one, but that's fine because every situation is different. Kenya, already in 2019, was the first African nation to issue green bonds, which we welcome a lot, and we have other of these examples in Africa. So the EU and Africa have different starting points, but we have the common imperative of unleashing sustainable finance, as I said, both private and public as well. So you asked us what the EU will do. Well, the EU, the European Union, will continue to support governments and businesses in this direction and in this endeavor. We have the Global Gateway from now until 2027, which will mobilize investment of 300 billion euros, 150 of which will go to Africa. That includes the European Sustainable Development Fund, which will provide guarantees to de-risk and leverage private investment, which we really see as a big opportunity and need in Africa as well. We have launched the Team Europe Commission with member states, the Team Europe Global Green Bond Initiative, to facilitate the flow of private capital into climate and environmental projects in partner countries, notably in Africa. And with the European Investment Bank, which is very present also during this conference, we have now committed 1 billion euros, which will mobilize, we estimate, 15 to 20 billion euros of investments in green bonds in partner countries. We have also set up an international platform on sustainable finance, to which we would invite all countries, including in Africa, to join, so that we have a common direction for this work. And indeed, as you said, Fanny, we have set up a high-level expert group on scaling up sustainable finance in low and middle-income countries, with exactly the ambition of finding what are the right tools, the right financial instruments, the right policy conditions and frameworks that we need in low and middle-income countries to make sure that this investment happens, very much in line with what we hear from Barbados indeed. A last point, if I may. All this must go together with domestic public revenue mobilization. You were absolutely right, but also with conducive, consistent green fiscal and budgetary policies, so that there is consistency in the signals we are sending as governments especially. That can include carbon taxes, as I mentioned, but also the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. And I would like to say that I strongly agree with the minister from Colombia that we not only have to rely on the private sector. The private sector is key. This agenda will not happen without a private sector massive involvement. But we also need to strengthen the public sector. The public sector must have the capacity to direct all these flows and to make sure that there is a revenue for the private sector, but also for society. Where there is potential return on investment, the private sector has to come in, and we have to make sure it does deliver a return on investment. But the climate agenda indeed also has areas for investment, like adaptation, where the return on investment is not that clear. And there, public support will indeed remain very important. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give Kurt a round of applause. I was very excited to hear two things from you. One, you mentioned the importance of the carbon price setting, and I just want to ask everyone, just look around the room at the posters behind you. Africa's carbon is exciting, Africa's carbon is fun, Africa's carbon is rich. It's definitely worth more than $3 to $5 a ton. So just look at the beautiful carbon on the posters behind you. And the second thing you mentioned is the importance of the domestic financial capital market. So it gives me an opportunity now to turn to Minister Andrew. For as long as I can remember, the UK has supported financial capital development in Africa. Why do you do that? And what are the areas that you see as priority going forward? And then secondly, what would you say that, or why would you say that building domestic financial markets in Africa is important in the context of these ongoing discussions about reforms to the global financial system?
Well, Franny, thank you very much for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel on such a very interesting subject. And your opening question is about why we have always prioritized markets and said how important the private sector is. And perhaps I can come on to that, but it is because most jobs around the world are provided by the private sector and not by governments. And therefore making sure that the private sector can operate and can use its magic to generate jobs, generate economic activity is incredibly important. I mean, the first answer I would like to make on the UK's commitment to support financial market development Africa is that our support is unequivocal, and we are facing a very difficult moment now at the halfway point to the 2030 SDGs, where the SDGs are way off track, and also there is the danger of a perfect storm coming, where we've got great anger in the global south at failure to deliver. We've got clear and consistent and terrifying evidence of weather events, and we've got a failure to drive and deliver the spirit and the promises from Paris. And we have to head off that perfect storm, and we've got a whole series of meetings now taking place ahead of the COP in the UAE in December, where on all three of those things, we as the members of the international community, working together, binding ourselves together, staying united and not allowing people to divide us between the East and the West, the South and the North, we can, I think, make progress on all three of those, and they are at the heart of what you are saying. Of course, there are terrible headwinds. The invasion of Ukraine by a member of the United Nations Permanent Five, with the multiple shocks which result, the effect on inflation, the effect on food flows, quite apart from the other shocks, have given very great difficulty and problems to all countries, but nowhere more so than in Africa. And our priority must be to create a fairer financial system. It must be to make sure that the multilateral development banks really sweat their assets and deliver a quantum leap in the amount of climate finance that is available. And I think there's a lot of terrific work going on to try and achieve that. But also we need to heed the message so clearly and brilliantly articulated by Mia Motley, the Bridgetown Agenda, which speaks to the heart of all of this. And at the same time as doing all of that, we need to ensure that the private sector, returning to what you said at the beginning, organizations like the British Development Finance Institution, BII, formerly CDC, investing not loans but risk equity in billions of pounds worth across Africa, employing directly something like 1 million people as a result of their investments, harnessing the public and the private sector together, the $60 trillion of pension funds, many of which are looking for a safe and constructive home in attacking climate change and developing safe and good climate instruments. We need to make sure that all of that is happening. And it's vital that we harness private capital effectively to achieve these climate ambitions. Domestic resources, such as the continent's combined 1 trillion institutional assets as well, have a critical role to play and could be put to pro-climate and pro-nature use, and yet they are vastly untapped. And shifting domestic resources, like these pension funds, which I've referred to, from traditional concentration in government treasuries into green investments, it also requires regulatory changes to allow more cross-border investments by pension funds and to optimize the allocation of assets. And the launch of the Pan-African Fund Managers Association, which I think we may be hearing more about later today, can stimulate precisely this thinking. Our thinking, and I shall be saying more about this in the coming weeks, when the British government paper, the White Paper, is released, which we are consulting on. It's Britain's hope and effort to provide some more thinking, some new thinking, both on how we put these SDGs back on track and how we can do more to achieve our climate finance aims. And we are busy consulting people across the world, in our own country, think tanks and universities, but around the world through our British Foreign Office missions to capitalize on thinking and trying to submit in a very humble way this paper to drive forward these agendas towards the end of the year. Because I think now is the time when we have to avoid that perfect storm and delivers. And this government paper will include ways of reforming the international global financial system to ensure our financial architecture is improved, more fit for purpose, and enables these greater levels of finance, which I've talked about, to flow. And in their jurisdictions, African countries are also introducing progressive green finance policies and regulations to strengthen their ability to benefit fully from these reforms, and new conduits are also required to channel this finance and ensure that the absorptive capacity of financial markets in Africa is increased. And having the necessary market infrastructure is therefore fundamental to attract, allocate, and scale green capital. And that is why I'm delighted to see that FSD Africa's work supporting the establishment of the Ethiopia Stock Exchange, the EABX, a fixed income securities exchange in Kenya, and launching key institutions like the Nairobi International Financial Center are taking place. And all of these will allow local capital markets to play their intermediation role more effectively. It is critical that we reduce the cost of finance, which, as we know, is currently significantly more expensive in Africa, undermining the economics of much needed local projects. It is ridiculous that our children in London can borrow for housing for 30 or 35 years at 5%, when African countries cannot get anything like that length of time and are faced with very high interest rates. We have to ensure that the system, not least through the G20 mechanisms, more accurately addresses the needs for debt restructuring so that we don't see what we saw in Zambia, which was a 2-year delay, which is completely wrong. Blending concessional finance from development banks and donors with private finance can obviously mobilize private capital, as others have said on this panel, particularly from cautious institutional investors. And finally, FSD Africa's investment of £10 million contribution to Acre Impact Capital Export Finance Fund is a very interesting case in point. It will help infrastructure projects that support mitigation and adaptation to access guarantee financing from export credit agencies by covering the commercial debt tranche. I think this is a great demonstration of how concessional finance can be catalytic, improving the effectiveness of export guarantee facilities while allowing local financial institutions to invest by managing their exposure to risk. This one initiative will give improved access to basic services for close to 500,000 people and generate over 2,000 jobs. Together, all these examples of innovative financing are a great reflection of what this summit is communicating, that it is possible to do transactions in Africa, that deals are happening. We look forward to working with FSD Africa and partners across the continent to help mobilize private finance in Africa while we work to reform the international financial system to deliver on both development and climate objectives. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. A round of applause to the Minister. I'm very pleased to hear you say 3 things, that despite this polycrisis world that we're facing, your government is looking at the future and financing climate and nature, focusing on creating dynamism in the capital markets in Africa that would help Africa help itself, and then also putting your money where it matters in terms of demonstrating that initiatives like public-private partnerships through bilateral aid could be catalytic and innovative. So thank you very much for that support, particularly to now in my new hat as a chair of FSD Africa to support those initiatives here on the continent. So we've come to the end of this panel. I want to ask you to lend a strong hand of applause to the panelists who have done an excellent job here. And to say now that I'm handing over to my colleague, Dr. Evans, who's going to moderate the next panel. So 90 minutes will be 3 segments of exciting 90 minutes. Dr. Evans.
Hey, bana ba Kenya namugeza ndi mulembe lundi baya mumbe kama rumwelezera ko bulayi bwo kuba nenda kama dunda ko buru bana ba Kenya namugeze ndi mulembe mulembe lundi oya mumbe kama rumwelezera ko bulayi bwo kuba nenda kamatunda ko buru ehe bana ba Kenya namugeze ndi mulembe mulembe lundi oya mumbe bulayi bwo kuba nenda kamatunda ko buru bana ba Kenya namugeze ndi mulembe mulembe lundi oya mumbe kama rumwelezera ko bulayi bwo kuba nenda kamatunda ko buru mu Kenya.
Okay, good afternoon. There's no one in the room. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Africa. It's now my honor and pleasure to invite to the panel my distinguished panelists, starting with Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury and Planning in the Republic of Kenya. Professor Njuguna. Thank you. A round of applause. I also want to invite to the stage Her Excellency Dr. Fitzman Asefa Adela, who is the Minister for Planning and Development in the Republic of Ethiopia. Welcome. You can have it. And I'd like to invite Alexia Latatu, who is the Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development in the U.S. Treasury. Welcome, Alexia. Maybe you can take the next one. Yeah. And then I'd like to invite Ademasu Dadese, who is the President Emeritus and Managing Director for the TDB Group. Thank you, Ademasu. And finally, but not least, I'd like to invite Aminu Umar Sadiq, the CEO for Nigeria's Sovereign Investment Authority. Welcome, Aminu. Okay. Sitting on this side. Alexia? Yeah. You can move that way.
Thank you.
Okay, that's better. I think that's okay. So thank you so much. So maybe before we get into the discussion, I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of the issues that we are discussing, which is domestic resource mobilization, domestic capital market development. Within Africa, we have about $1.4 trillion of assets under management sitting between insurance funds, collective investment vehicles, pension funds, and sovereign wealth investment funds. Now, the bulk of that, about $420 billion, is held by pension funds. What we know is that those assets have been very conservatively invested. 6 to 7% of that is invested in government securities. And in some countries, the number is as high as 90%. The institutional investors find it easy to invest in government securities because they're getting a relatively decent rate of return, and they believe these are safe assets. But of course, much more recently, we have seen increasing appetite to diversify the investments. But because this capital is used to investing in relatively traditional assets that are considered up-to-date, fairly safe and rewarding, nudging them towards alternatives is not something that's going to happen overnight, so there's a need of support required. We need to create the right kind of instruments where they can invest. Some of those instruments include green bonds. In Africa, we have about $4 billion outstanding, but we are seeing a lot of momentum. And I believe that perhaps maybe in the next 3 years, we should be able to double the outstanding green bonds in the market. We've also seen a lot of interest towards sustainability-linked, or what we call KPI-linked bonds. And in some cases, some interest to incorporate carbon credits in enhancing some of the financing instruments that are being issued in the market. But we also need market infrastructure. Market infrastructure can take different forms. We've heard about the bond exchanges that are being launched here in Kenya, the Ethiopian Securities Exchange that is going to be launched in Ethiopia. but we also need credit enhancement facilities that transfer the credit risk to some extent from the pension funds or institutional investors to entities that are able to carry on that risk as the market becomes a bit more mature. And then there's, of course, a lot of room for blended finance. There's a lot of room for sovereign wealth funds to play a big role in co-investment and catalyzing that investment into green projects across the continent. So with that sort of preamble, I want to go straight to the panel, and I want to start with Professor Njuguna Ndung'u. Perhaps maybe you can, in a few words, tell us what the Kenyan priorities are as far as green financing are concerned. And by the way, congratulations also for this event that is very well organized. Thank you so much, Professor Njuguna.
Thank you very much, Evans, and I've been with Evans for many years, so he happens to know me quite well. And thank you very much. I think I listened to the other session that was late to attend, and there's quite interesting dimensions that came up. And I've been asked about priorities, and one of the things is actually to stay, the priority is growth. And that is why the new administration has bottom-up economic transformation agenda. And I've been, for example, talking about it and saying, these are two phrases, and you can actually have to ask yourself, why bottom-up? And the second thing is, why transformation, economic transformation? So the first thing is to realize that it's an agenda, and you can see that after a series of, should I say, negative surprise shocks that have actually been persistent, they have produced more than a permanent effect. You can see it's like a structural effect. They require some structural reforms to move out of that kind of deep end, or should I say, recession. It's a very deep recession, which can actually be permanent. So that's why one of the priorities is, because most people have been left in abject poverty, they are at the bottom of the pyramid, how do you rescue them from there? So it means that one of the issues is about interventions that actually can actually lift those at the bottom of the pyramid, because essentially they have been put there first because could be an institutional failure problem, but more importantly in the recent past, the devastating effects of COVID-19, the Ukrainian crisis that was mentioned, because it's created such massive supply side shocks, and then the climate change, which has actually reversed perhaps 20 years of efforts on poverty reduction and even inequality, and even introduced a new dimension of social conflict because of natural resources. So you can see those devastating effects are very, very important to try to move or to push so many people into the bottom of the pyramid. The second component of that is actually economic transformation. And one of the things is to ask, have we ever seen any form of economic transformation? And why has it failed in most of the African economies? And why has it failed in our economy? So that's why it's an agenda, because we want to ask questions, why? You know, and the starting point is actually, maybe going into that, is actually to say, we need massive private investment, and more so, public investments, because public investments will provide a framework through which they create a conducive environment for private sector to thrive. Why I say that is that most of the public investments lower transactions cost. And if they lower transactions cost, and especially for farms, and especially small farms and medium MSMEs as we call them, they are transactions heavy. So the moment public investment lowers their transactions cost, then it enhances their profitability. Because the previous panel was talking about who creates jobs. It's actually the private sector who creates massive jobs. So in a sense, when you're enhancing the profitability of private investment, then you're actually enhancing their investment. Let me even move another point. I can move to another point also in that same vein. You find that economic recession is also driven by failure to invest. And the moment an investor cannot appropriate returns on their own investment, then it means that they cannot expand and they cannot grow. And so you can see that this is a major issue that we're coming up. There's a new debate. I think a few of my friends from the World Bank have a theme for next year, that is World Economic Report, on middle-income countries and why they stagnate. And one of the questions is why middle-income countries actually stagnate. And we can go back and even try to say, what are the answers in this country? For example, in our country today, and because you asked about priorities. Look at components of human capital development, and you can ask ourselves, where are we? If you have impaired human capital development, then it means that even the leadership in institutions, even the leadership in some of the critical institutions is going to be impaired. And that means that the institutional failure problem will actually affect the policy performance and will drive policy failure. The second thing I wanted to add to that is that when we talk about private sector and even markets, especially you talked about markets, we need to come up with new instruments to help the market grow and become vibrant. And we have seen that in some decades. But the moment you have constrained instruments in the private sector, then things don't seem to work. And then you start asking yourself, why is the market slackening? When we started in 2000 in terms of reform for the pension funds, for the pension reforms, they were supposed to actually deepen the financial markets. And then it was easy now to even establish a market for private sector debt. For public sector debt. And we also created a market for private sector debt. Unfortunately, that didn't move very well. Public debt became quite marketable, but you can see it has slackened a bit. So in a sense, we need to come back and say, how do we create a lot of vibrancy? But at the end of the day, what actually happens is that growth, when growth is constrained, then a recession stems in. That vibrancy does not create the momentum that we require. And that is why we find that everything that we go around, we find that it is that momentum that has been killed, the recession that is dominating. Yeah. We can start blaming, for example, climate change is one of the latest effects. But if you go back to history 5 years back, you'll see that climate change was even coming after all the other effects were already becoming quite clear. So we can actually then talk about what is going to ignite growth and vibrancy in growth. And that is where we start from. That's why we bring in the private sector. That's why we bring in the financial market. And that's why we come in and say the whole collective action problem that we are facing is actually a collective action problem from the climate side to the private sector to the financial system.
Thank you so much, Professor. And we've talked a lot about policy, the role of market infrastructure, financial sector development in climate financing as well. And we've also talked about a number of priorities also in the social as well as the real economy. I want to now turn to Dr. Adela. I know Ethiopia is going through a significant financial sector transformation with the establishment of the Ethiopia Capital Markets Authority, the establishment of directives or regulations, the Ethiopia Securities Exchange. How significant is that in domestic capital market mobilization? And to what extent do you think that is also going to contribute to climate financing?
Thank you so much. So, building climate resilient, carbon neutral economy requires multi-billion dollar investment, which should be mobilized from all sources using all the available instruments. So notwithstanding the critical need for public finance to address the structural development challenge in a country like Ethiopia, Ethiopia believes that it's really important to reform the finance infrastructure so that we mobilize the adequate resource for both public and private investment. So with this idea in mind and with commitment, Ethiopia has is in the process of, launching the capital market very soon. So it's very important that we utilize all our resources efficiently when one considers especially the huge investment need to achieve fast, sustainable and equitable growth for a country like Ethiopia with huge development need and gap on the ground to reduce poverty and address all the development challenge. So the government's decision to establish a capital market impinges on the idea that we have to harness the untapped domestic financial resource in the country and use, of course, the market tool to efficiently allocate this resource to their most optimal utilization. Moreover, as our global financial architecture has become more unpredictable and really far reached for especially countries like Ethiopia, it's really important that we find ways to raise domestic capital for government expenditure through issuance of debt instruments so that we are able to secure our financial sovereignty somehow. Even if we operate in a globalized world, it's really important in such unpredictable global financial situations to have such thing as a fallback position as well. So today, as we all know, the global capital market is out of reach for most of African countries, not only Ethiopia. So as a result of legacy debt issues and without mobilization of domestic resources, governments will find it difficult to cover most of their expenditure and investment needs. So for us, it's really timely to operationalize capital market to broaden the already functioning government primary securities market and enable private sector participants to secure their financing needs, especially investments that require long-term returns. We are also, of course, confident that a well-regulated deep capital market is a good entry point for international investors with an appetite for an emerging market like Ethiopia, an emerging investment opportunity. So when the securities exchange becomes operational next year, in addition to the government debt instruments that will be traded on the secondary market, we anticipate some of the major domestic companies, both private and public or state-owned enterprises, would be listed. So this would be, we believe this would be a great opportunity for both domestic and international investors. This is really beneficial. Your question about how can this be beneficial for climate finance in Ethiopia, the lack of such financial infrastructure kept private finance or the private sector to have negligible investment in climate-related investments. So especially for climate finance, I think we should look at the capital market as a vehicle that will help investable climate-compliant opportunities to have access to significant financial resources. Especially, such capital markets have stringent ESG requirements, yes? Yeah. The environment, social, and governance requirements, which will make them very, of course, fertile for any climate-compliant instruments, financial instruments in the market. So this would mean less transaction costs for any investor to get access to a list of investable opportunities that will further encourage climate finance products to be listed on the exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So clearly a very exciting period for Ethiopia. Do you have a timeline when we might expect the Ethiopia Securities Exchange to launch? I'm sure there are a lot of investors in this room who are looking to come and participate in those initial public offerings that you have mentioned.
Sure. The authority is already established. All regulatory frameworks have been issued most of it. So beginning of 2024 would be, the timeline for the launch of the capital market.
So beginning 2024. Thank you so much. Let me turn now to Alexia. And so Alexia, I wanted to just ask you one question. Maybe you can give the US government perspectives on why it is important for African countries to continue deepening their financial markets, especially in view of the global financial architecture reforms that are underway.
Thank you. Thank you so much, moderator, and I'm really thrilled to have this question, particularly because we're here in Africa, that we look at domestic capital markets. We're not just looking elsewhere. I think that's really important. And obviously, African countries, like all emerging markets, are facing enormous challenges in raising and mobilizing the vast amount of money that is needed to build critical infrastructure that is desperately needed to support growing populations, to create jobs, to enable the delivery of basic services, water, health, sanitation, education, healthcare, etc. And of course, the ability to do all of the above has been exacerbated by climate change. The previous panel spoke about that urgency, so I won't belabor the point. But we know that there is a $15 trillion gap between the money available and the money needed to be able to build this critical infrastructure between now and 2040. Private money is not a magic bullet. I do not believe in magic bullets, but public money alone will not be able to bridge this gap, especially in a context where we see so many emerging markets with fiscally strained position and with debt also described in the last panel. And so there is some hope. Yeah. We know that there's about $120 trillion in pools of institutional savings held by institutional investors. But there's an imbalance between where these pools of savings are and where the needs are. A few stark numbers. 7 countries hold 90% of global pensions. Another non-OECD countries hold another 8%, and only 2% is held by non-OECD countries, primarily Hong Kong, Brazil, and India. All right, and so we need to be able to do a much better job in matching pension fund, insurance company, endowment liabilities to climate-aligned infrastructure in emerging markets. It's an uphill ask, I have to be honest, because OECD pension funds are inherently somewhat risk-averse, with all due respect to them. They're wary of all kinds of risks: political risks, regulatory and legal risks, foreign exchange risks, Franny mentioned in her opening. And simply put, sometimes they're just dissuaded by their own lack of experience in emerging markets and in investing in emerging markets. And so we need to redouble our efforts to change the status quo and to build domestic capital and debt markets. We need to be in a world where we can match 30-year Naira-dominated loans funded by Naira savings to 30-year renewable energy infrastructure projects in Nigeria. That's the goal. And getting to this goal, achieving this, has a lot of advantages, right? So it will help minimize currency risk. It will help insulate economies on the continent against capital flight. And it will align the incentives of savers with the incentives of policymakers. And I think there's a huge government potential win here if countries themselves are making sure that their population and their savings knows how they're investing in building their own domestic infrastructure. So we need these deeper markets, but we also need markets that provide much longer tenures that are needed to build climate-aligned infrastructure. So we need at least 20 to 30 years, whereas we know today that we have much shorter tenures in African debt markets. Even 10 to 15 year debt markets are relatively illiquid. And perhaps the trickiest bit, we need to gain the confidence of savers so that they know their principal will be safe and so that they know that they will be able to earn a fair and inflation-adjusted return. How do we do all of this? It's not for the faint-hearted. We need to invest in good macroeconomic management. I would say this as someone from a Treasury Department, Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure you agree with me, and prudential safeguards. We need to invest in institutions that provide credible deposit insurance. We need effective banking supervision. You touched on this point. We need good governance, property rights that protect against appropriation. In short, we need a strong public sector to be able to have robust private finance. But can we please stop arguing public or private? We need both. This panel represents both. So let me end, because I know time is short, by saying the following. I recognize that building strong, robust domestic, local, and capital markets is a long-term endeavor. It's a multi-year, multi-decade endeavor. We have short-term urgent needs for injections of capital, and we're working on that. We need the sprint, but we also need to be running the marathon on making sure Africa can have robust, deep domestic and capital markets that will provide a more proper governance between citizens of Africa and their policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that. I think you've talked a lot about the size, the sheer size of the opportunity, but also the challenges and how to, of course, navigate the challenges so that we can realize, the potential. Thank you so much for your intervention. I want to turn now to Tadesse. TDB is a regional, an African-based multilateral development bank. So you have a market building mandate as well. So I wanted you to share some examples of how TDB has been involved in innovations, especially around the climate finance area.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here with the esteemed members on the panel. Naturally, TDB, as you've mentioned, is a development finance institution. So we do a lot of sustainability financing, green financing, climate financing. I'll just zero in very quickly on the theme of the panel around African institutional capital, because one of the opportunities that we felt was being missed in our industry was to be able to attract that kind of capital which normally doesn't find its way into our type of institution. So we embarked on some very bold reforms and innovated our capital structure to actually test whether this 1 trillion of African institutional capital is actually out there, ready, willing, and able to come in. And in short, we managed to really shoot out the lights in that experiment. We today count close to 15 African institutional investors in our Tier 1 capital. And very quickly we realized there was much more to be done, and we've now embarked on innovating our Tier 2 capital, which is a combination of preferred shares and also hybrid capital in line with the G20 recommendations around recapitalizing MDBs. And we've already begun to have some success on the Tier 2 capital side, in addition to the very good results we've had in the Tier 1 side. Historically, of course, we issued debt, bonds, and those are listed. Because we are an international bank, we tend to operate mostly in hard currency, so we've typically issued Euro bonds out of the UK and Irish exchange, US investors as well. But now we've begun to look at dual listings, and we recently managed to dual list our Euro bonds in the Mauritius capital markets, where we're looking at the Nairobi Securities Exchange as well to see if we can have dual listings. And at the same time, we're also working closely with the Millennium Challenge initiative to see if we can potentially list our Tier 2 capital on African exchanges as well as potentially outside of Africa. We're doing it carefully because there's some sensitive issues to be looked at, but we feel that African institutional investors have really been quite impressive in the way they've understood the risk-return value proposition we've put out there. We've been paying dividends, financial as well as development dividends to our institutional investors for almost 8 years running. They've more than doubled their money, but at the same time, they've made a huge impact in terms of financing a real economic development, including renewable energy, which is more than 50% of our power portfolio. And our total portfolio now as TDB is about $8 billion. So just to say that the thesis of the panel, African institutional capital is there, and you can actually access it. You just have to work at it, you have to reform, and you have to be innovative.
Thank you very much. And thanks for also the very precise answer to that. So Aminu, over to you. The Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more what you're doing to support the mobilization of domestic capital in Nigeria. And then collectively, I know there are a number of now sovereign wealth funds across Africa. What kind of role can they also play in this supporting this financing agenda?
Thank you very much. I think our distinguished panel have spoken eloquently about, from a strategic standpoint, what they're doing to mobilize such capital. So I'll speak more broadly from a tactical perspective. I think when you speak to the pension funds domestically, they are very clear that their priorities are first safety, then liquidity, before returns. So I think the first thing that one has to think through is, in a safe manner, how do you mobilize such conservative capital towards what is typically a risky asset class in frontier economies, which is infrastructure? How do you organize a well-capitalized, well-governed, well-managed vehicle to give that comfort to conservative capital providers who prioritize safety in order to channel that long-term local currency financing into domestic infrastructure? The NSIA has done that through a company called InfraCredit that I think has been going for the last 6 years and has actually performed a fundamental role in not only mobilizing domestic capital, but also deepening our capital markets, which brings me to the second point, liquidity. No pension fund, despite their long tenures, wants to be stuck with certain instruments. And therefore, this is where the country, the sovereigns themselves, need to ensure that they put in place fiscal policies to ensure that the capital markets are an interesting, attractive place for investors, to ensure that that liquidity risk, as much as possible, is mitigated. And I think the third part, which is very important from a tactical standpoint, is around project development. It's one thing to say you want to encourage long-term domestic capital to finance projects, but which projects? No one wants to invest in a losing proposition. And so that expertise around project development, ensuring that they are well thought out, that they are bankable, is also an extremely important component. So I think a combination of these three things from a tactical level should move the needle over time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So unfortunately, we have run short of time, but this has been an excellent discussion. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating, and I want to invite the next moderator, Bogelo, to come on stage to take us through the next section. Thank you so much.
All right. too close to the mic. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience and for you staying till the very end of this panel. We are now going to be discussing project development and the project pipeline. And given time and that we're running behind schedule, I wish to ask our panelists to make their way to the stage and to allow us to get started. And therefore, I'd like to call Madam Nados Bekele Thomas, the CEO of Ouda NAPED, Dr. Sidi Ould Tah, the DG of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, Ron Mincy, Head of Africa, CFP, BlackRock Climate Finance, and Mr. Solomon Queno, VP Private Sector, Infrastructure and Industrialization at AFDB. If I may please have my panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't see the panelists give me a little shimmy. Can I have some of that music one last time, please? Who's playing that music? Where is the DJ? Okay, you play music when we don't want it. And then when we want it, you don't play it. That's unfair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you to this session of, thank you for joining this session on project initiation and project management. My name is Bogolo Joy Ginowendo, and I'll be your moderator today. And we've had many conversations today about what it takes to finance projects in the continent. And I want to give you a little bit of context, stealing from one of the op-eds we published as we were heading to Paris in June. We have been creating this pipeline, the compendium of climate action pipeline of projects. And some of the projects that we have listed in our team is one in East Africa, a startup company, Ampersad Solar, that has a plan to transition millions of border taxi drivers to cheaper, cleaner electric motorcycles. In Nigeria, there's an energy company, Phoenix Edison, that is ready to build the country's first waste-to-energy project, reducing municipal waste and carbon emissions. In Kenya, there's a fertilizer maker, Safi Organics, and it's converting local biomass waste into fertilizers and is aiming to provide farmers with income from carbon credits. There are many of these projects that are proven and ready to grow. They will create jobs, they'll reduce emissions, and they'll promote sustainable development in the continent. But they, as many similar business ventures around the developing world, are struggling to attract appropriate finance because capital is expensive and investments are perceived to be risky. So as a result, today we will be discussing what it takes to start a project pipeline. Why is there this perception that there are no projects, climate projects in the continent? And what are some of the lessons we can learn from existing financial institutions that operate in the continent? I will therefore be joining our panel to jumpstart this conversation. once again help me in welcoming and thanking our panelists. Thank you, Solomon. False habit. All right, so we were supposed to have been joined by Madam Nados Tegele of Ouder Napid. She has been held up and she will be represented by Dr. Tuela Patricia Rosemary Jere, also from Ouder Napid. And as a result, she will be our first question will go to her. Given the background that I just gave, Ms. Jere, Dr. Jere, from Ouder Napid's point of view, what do you think that we are still struggling with creating project pipeline in the continent? How do we ensure that we build an investable pipeline in Africa? And is it just more of a money issue that is being needed? And how are you building your portfolio at Ouder Napid?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to fellow panelists, and good afternoon to the participants as well. So I think maybe just to echo what was already said in the previous discussion, I think it's important to underscore the fact that we do indeed need both public and private sources of capital, and also the fact that if we are indeed going to accelerate green transformation, that we need to also then be very deliberate about how we promote the favorable policy and regulatory frameworks that allow our projects to advance. Having said that, I think from the perspective of AUD and NEPAD, and with specific reference to the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which represents really, I think, the largest opportunity for investment in infrastructure across the continent, what we have seen is that I think there are two specific things that we would like to deal with and address. The first one has to do with really minimizing the failure rate of these projects in terms of being able to move them quickly to feasibility, and then secondly, to reduce the time that it takes for these projects to move towards bankability. And what we've seen is that there is a need to actually have very deliberate instruments that address that specific aspect of project preparation. And we have two that we are using currently, which is the service delivery mechanism. The service delivery mechanism, which basically is working with our various member states and project owners to support them in the process of actually preparing the projects and accessing project financing. The second one is the PIDA quality label, which is looking at how to certify the excellence in project preparation to make sure that when the projects go out to look for financing, that the financiers can be assured that all the relevant checks and balances and rigorous due diligence has been done such that those projects can indeed be funded. Having said that, I think what we're also seeing more and more, and especially as we start to look at the innovative sources of financing, whether we're talking about the climate financing, the green bonds, etc., is that there is a need to do a very deliberate matching of the projects to the different kinds of funds and financiers that are out there. We recognize, I think, that there are some capacity challenges in terms of the ability of member states perhaps to be able to access climate financing, to understand the different nuances of how to access climate financing, and therefore we would like to put more effort in terms of developing and building the requisite capacity, but also providing the relevant support such that we can make our projects, number one, climate resilient, and number two, able to attract climate financing.
Thank you very much. I think I'd also like to know, how do we usually speak about bigger projects, sometimes even cross-boundary projects. Now, I gave examples of smaller private sector, sometimes social investments. How do we get investors to listen?
I think the way that we have looked at this is that, we obviously understand the fact that when we start talking about regional integration, we have to talk about those big projects. But at the same time, I think when we start to follow an approach, which we are calling the integrated corridor approach, it's calling on us to look at the 4 sectors, so ICT, water, transport, and energy, in a very integrating and integrative manner. But it is also calling on us to look at the linkages between that cross-border infrastructure and the national infrastructure, as well as the services that that infrastructure delivers. So there has to be very clear linkages of that infrastructure to health, to education, to trade, and to making sure that we're able to use that infrastructure to actually provide the opportunities for MSMEs and the smaller projects at a national level. So I think there has to be that linkage and that very deliberate way of how we link national infrastructure to regional and cross-border investments as well.
Thank you so much. I think that actually brings us right to Ms. Fatima. First, congratulations on your AAA rating. I'd like to know from your perspective, in preserving your AAA rating, does that prevent you from attending to innovative projects like the ones I gave examples of? How do you balance maintaining your AAA rating and venturing into newer, innovative, a little riskier projects?
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and thank you for the Kenyan government, our host, and the organizers from UNFCCC and the Africa Climate Summit and the distinguished panel. So, if I may, I think having a AAA rating was not a casual result. It was actually a strive that the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa has really strived for. If I may start by reiterating the fact that we all agree on the greatest channel facing Africa in accessing climate finance is the fact that the climate challenges emerge at a time where the continent is already burdened with heavy debt, which gives a very little room to the public sector borrowing. And that actually demands a different type of instruments, a different type of financial institution to serve a new contract between the continent and the climate finance. And I think with that, we had to evolve as a bank. We've been working with our 18-member Arab League countries that are actually our shareholders for the last 48 years in the continent in financing development projects. But with Africa taking up the commitment towards sustainability, towards financing the SDGs, the demand has grown tremendously. And automatically we had to grow. And I think the AAA rating gives a leverage to the continent in accessing a better financial instruments from the global market. When you are a AAA rated institution, you have better access to leverage, to have a better borrowing prices. And that actually works against the prevailing risk of the continent, but also the perceived risk. If you have institutions that are operating in the continent and they are able to lend to African countries, whether public or private, and we have also a large trade portfolio. My colleagues in the earlier panel are actually good partners in our different financing. I think we have a better chance for ensuring that they have access to new innovative instruments. We've opened up for all different types of innovation as BADIA. We have worked through across the stream of under our BADIA 2030 strategy, which put climate focus as a center of it because it's an SDG focus and you can't do anything about SDGs if you just neglect sustainability. So we worked even with CPOs, financing them to do pilot projects on adaptation, mangrove plantation, for example, in Gambia. Or we are working on a new initiative where we're looking at different options of blending finance to ensure the continent has not only, I would say, good price finance, but also a finance that speaks to the demand, that is relevant to a new climate contract that we invite you to join us for all the development institution. And I'll stop here. I think you have also the FDP here to speak better, our sister institution.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually quite inspirational and opening yourself up for partnerships as well. And we'll circle back to you. I have a little bit more. But I want to jump over to you, Ron, and ask you from a large investor's perspective, what level of deal preparation do you expect from project originators and project owners? And do you have space to co-create with others, such as Badia or AFDB? What opportunities do they exist?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you to the organizers and to Kenya and to the African Union. It's inspiring to have us all together. Very good question. You know, I think the context of being a large investor, we also need to talk about being a private investor and answer the question in that context. So let me give the short answers. Yes, we have the ability to co-create. Our fund that is investing in emerging markets and specifically in Africa, we do have a mandate to take on some development capital risk as long as we see line of sight to putting in that larger equity check. So we are an investor that can take some risk early on and also kind of have an extended hold period. In terms of the level of preparation, we, like many others, we operate this capital, make this capital available through funds. And most of the fund structures in market are close-end funds. So they have an investment period of, say, 5 years. They have a realization period of, say, 5 to 7 years. So what ends up being a constraint to the first comments that we heard is actually the time. And so I do like to push back on the notion that they're not investable projects. I have a lot of respect for the developers, the people that work with the developers that are trying to bring these concepts through to fruition. And a lot of these concepts, even at early stage, they are the right thing. And even the mechanics of how they come together could be the right thing. But the time that it takes and then the capital that it takes to get there, it ends up being a constraint. And so because we have a closed-end fund, we have to select those transactions, those development partners, and the ecosystems within they work to make sure that those projects could actually move in the cycle and we could end up putting in the equity check, et cetera. So that's really the constraint. So what we're looking for is we can come pretty early, but when we come early, we would like that to be in a sort of an enabling environment in an ecosystem that you can move from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, that engagement with government, there's a clear sort of sequencing, et cetera. And project development often doesn't work that way. It's not linear. It's if you were to draw it out on a map, it would look like spaghetti or a spider web, right? So it's hard to do that. We do look for you know, line of sight or really locked in land if it's going to be for a larger scale project. If it's going to be for a smaller scale project, as you were mentioning, we'd like to really understand early on what that offtake looks like. Is it contractual? Is it you know, exposed to uptake or what we call merchant risk? So we do look for those items, and then we look for the capacity within the team as well. Just because, as I mentioned, it's not linear, and so where there could be a team that has done a lot of work on the ground, done a lot of engagement with the government, maybe has started on some feasibility studies, and then have run short of capital. Have they looked to partner with another developer, and can we augment that, for example? So those are all areas. Let me stop there because I know you have other questions.
Thanks, Ron. So we've been compiling this compendium of projects, as I mentioned earlier, and we found that you know, most countries revert back to NDCs. Is that something that large investors actually look at? Do you consider what countries have put together for submission to UNFCCC, or you're looking elsewhere?
We do look at both. I mean, one of the things where we see value is in bilateral conversations. They tend to produce some interesting results when you can move on. The compendium, as you mentioned, where that can have some positive side is just the engagement with government and the engagement with organizations that do help with the preparation facility. So there could be a bit of cover in those type of projects, and especially give you some scale. So we don't shy away from that at all. I think the true answer to what you asked is both. Right? We'll look at small scale developers who are trying to develop something scalable over time, and we'll look at kind of government backed or government partnered development projects.
Great, thanks. And coming over to you, Solomon, project preparation facilities are still very small in the continent and very hard to access, largely disconnected from follow-on funding and de-risking mechanisms. In fact, project finance volumes in low and middle income countries have dropped from 91 billion in 2019 to less than 60 billion in 2022. Now, I know that you've been heavily involved in financing climate action projects. When you look across the continent and you consider the much discussed infrastructure funding gap, even at project facilitation stages, what do you think needs to be done strategically to create investment opportunities, especially for local private capital providers?
Okay, thank you very much, Bogolo. As you know, I'm very passionate about domestic capital markets development in Africa. I've heard the estimate of $1 trillion of assets under management. We estimate that between African sovereign wealth funds, African pension funds, African life insurance investment pools, and also the collective investment vehicles across Africa, we actually have $2.3 trillion under management. However, as was said earlier, most of this is invested in government treasuries and also government bonds. So for us, both in terms of ensuring that the balance between risk perceived and reality is bridged, supporting really the creation of risk asset classes for this set of African institutional investors is absolutely key. Now, what are some of the things that we're actually doing systematically and strategically to create this risk assets? When you take a look at infrastructure development in Africa, you've got to look at the whole spectrum of the financing cycle, from project development, early equity investment, then investment really to bring the projects to financial close, and then bringing in the institutional capital that doesn't want to take construction risk or doesn't really want to take any risk on stability of cash flows. So the institutional investors we're talking about in Africa are really on the extreme right end, bankable projects. So one of the first things we've done is we've created Africa 50, the premier project development facility, infrastructure project development facility in Africa. We've mobilized over $1 billion in 31 countries, from 31 governments and also 2 central banks and ourselves to really kickstart Africa 50. What they are supposed to do is develop bankable projects, provide early equity investment, and also mobilize institutional capital. So a good example of that recently is they are raising a $500 million, a small ticket, not so much for the investment amount, but more because African institutional capital took comfort in the African Development Bank being there, and the fund has been able to reach first close on that basis. But as you know, what do they say? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. So we've also supported the Africa Finance Corporation in setting up the Association of Infrastructure Project Developers in Africa, called AFIDA. And through this, we are also influencing the infrastructure project development market across Africa. And one deliberate example that focuses on green infrastructure, especially given what the Colombian minister mentioned earlier today, we have an emergency situation when it comes to climate. We cannot continue to develop projects over the typical 5 to 7 or even 10 years. Just too much time. So we have set up the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, in partnership with Outer NEPAD and the African Union Commission, driven by ourselves in Africa 50, but working really with partners from Europe, other African DFIs. We have set up this to raise $400 million of project development funds and $100 million of project preparation funds. We hope this would catalyze over $10 billion worth of projects, and it covers really all the infrastructure space, you know, power, transport, water, ICT, etc. And the idea here is to do it really with scale and speed. We want to bring the project development period down to 2 to 3 years. We want to provide money where there are good projects so that the lack of financing and the lack of project development skills is actually bridged. We also have the Africa Investment Forum, where we bring in bankable projects to bring investors, promoters, governments together to unblock whatever the issues are to ensure that really these transactions proceed to financing. And this is one of the innovations that we have. Lastly, let me talk about the African Sovereign Investors Forum, because I think this is very key. There are about 13 different African sovereign wealth funds and strategic investment funds that have come together to create the African Sovereign Investors Forum. And this actually is intended to really support the development of strategic projects country by country, but also regionally. So for example, the Sovereign Fund of Egypt is really working on Nuafi and also the green hydrogen projects. The Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority that we met earlier is also really working on, catalyzing the $30 billion worth of pension funds to invest really in infrastructure projects through InfraCredit. Given that I was there at the inception of InfraCredit and I used to be on the board, they have been able to actually credit wrap about $300 million worth of infrastructure bonds in Naira. And these are the sorts of mechanisms that we're looking to really replicate across Africa. But once again, I can go on forever, so let me stop there, but there are lots of other ideas that we have strategically and systematically to create risk assets for the African pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance pools.
Right. Thanks, Solomon. I think you'll be very interested with the very short next segment on PAFMA and what exactly, how exactly they intend to mobilize domestic capital. So to wrap up our session, I would like to ask all of you one question, and I will start with you, Solomon. We've all been talking about risk all day. Junior risk, early stage risk, all of that. But in our experience in setting up this project compendium, we've noticed that countries have NDCs, but do not have ability for project origination. There has been very little information provided in the term sheets that Ron was talking about. And we know if we do not have these things, then there is no project to talk about. There's no junior risk to assume. So how do we crowd in grants, philanthropy, to get into the space, to provide capacity, to work on project origination so that the big guys like yourselves can come in and ensure that the projects are financed?
So, Bugolo, this is why I was talking about the African Sovereign Wealth Funds and the African Strategic Investment Funds. For me, this is a major discovery. First of all, these are entities that work with good governance, commercial discipline, okay, and are smart investors. Governments have actually provided them funds. Given some of the good work they're doing, they're able to really attract other providers of project development capital, whether it's foundations, whether it's multilateral development banks like ourselves. So, for example, the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund has actually been at the forefront of developing projects. So we have also decided to provide them debt to actually leverage their investments to create more projects. And this is also creating an attractive vehicle for really, foundations and other providers of blended finance, especially as we focus on green infrastructure. So please, I think, one of the things we really need to focus on is the African Sovereign Investor Forum and its members, because it's going to really be very catalytic, it's going to be efficient. I will not do an infrastructure project in the country without them as partners, or at least without checking in with them first. And I think that's going to also apply to those who are providing project development capital.
Right. Thanks, Solomon. Ron?
I think there's a role
Unless you say you're okay to...
say again?
Unless you say, no, we're okay, we'll cover...
No. Well, I wouldn't say that. No, I do think that there's a role to play for a partnership between technical assistance providers, consultants and advisors. And some of them do this already, right? They leverage maybe public sources of capital to then be able to provide some of those services to help projects move along in early stages, right? Where you need to do a pre-feasibility study to put things in a form that perhaps a wider audience of investors could take on. And I do think that institutions like actually all of the institutions up here can do to help attract that in is to be having direct dialogue with those service providers in concert with private sector investors, so we can really articulate the specific things that we're looking for and say, look, here's the type of risk that I can take on, because investors take risk. We take risks, right? So we can take some of it. We need someone else to take this piece of risk, and all of the rest of my panelists offer a lot of credibility in terms of pulling that all together. So I would add that in. We're a piece of the puzzle, but we need some partners as well.
Thanks, Ron. Fatima?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you've tapped very well on the issue of capacity in terms of resource mobilization within the continent. While us as a multilateral development bank can do a lot in terms of enhancing the pricing of the borrowing in the capital adequacy, for example, we had in 22 an increase in the capital of Badia to up to 20 billion for the callable capital. But I think we do recognize that we can't do it alone. And I think when it comes to capacity development, there is a broad range of entities that are actually well-equipped and positioned to help countries and to help even private sector in accessing financeable projects that are actually well assessed. And that spares us a lot of the time as financial institution. And in many occasions, this is actually cost recovered in some cases, either by the fact that the project will be a bankable project, so the entity that is actually developing the project will have the final product. But I think for us as a development bank, it's actually a must. And I would say for us, Africa is the lungs that is still breathing of the world. So if we're genuine about resuscitating that lungs, we should not spare efforts in terms of capacity enhancement for making sure that the projects that the continent put up front for climate financing are something that is actually fundable, financeable, but also relevant to the population themselves. So there is a real sustainability, and we don't do an ad hoc intervention and it disappears within 3-4 years of the activity itself. I think we need a real partnership, and as I said, we need a real new climate contract. I prefer to call it the new climate contract. Right. The current contract does not serve us anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. Tawela?
Thank you. So I think giving credit, to our governments, the history of infrastructure financing, I think, has shown that quite a significant amount of funding comes from the public sector. But I think that tends to come in the later stages of the project cycle. And the problem that we always have is with the early stages. And I think this is where perhaps the blended approaches in terms of being able to leverage other forms of financing to support that project preparation is important. But I think what we also would like to advocate for is some kind of built-in cost recovery mechanisms that make that grant financing a bit more sustainable so that we can continue to repurpose and reuse those funds to support more and more projects and bring them online.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. I believe that they've made it clear that we do need to unlock climate finance in the continent. It makes sense for everyone. It is an imperative for both business, for climate action, and for sustainable development. And most importantly, it's a multi-stakeholder partnership arrangement that's needed in order to drive and unlock climate finance in the continent. I wish to thank our panelists for joining us and for making time, and to thank you for staying so late. Thank you, and good evening to the panelists. I still have one more thing to announce. Thank you. You may vacate.
Thank you so much.
We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. You are part of the solution. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. Let us all rise, rise, Pambazuka. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka.
PEMC. Thank you, thank you.
Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution.
Hello. You can't play the music when I don't want it. Earlier I asked for music and you refused. Now I don't want it. Thank you. I have 5 more minutes left in my program and our joint program. Earlier today, the Pan-African Fund Managers Association, PAFMA, signed an MOU that brings together fund managers across Africa to discuss matters of mutual concern and interest to promote solutions-based approach within the context of Africa's regional operating environment and priorities. And it is my great pleasure to welcome the founding members of PAFMA, the Pension Operators Association of Nigeria, the Fund Managers Association of Kenya, the Botswana Investment Professional Society, the Ghana Securities Industry Association, and the Investment Management Association of Uganda, as well as FSD Africa as a sponsor. If I may just have you quickly join me on stage, please, so we can finalize this session. Thank you. Gentlemen, I feel outnumbered on the stage. I didn't see it before, Evans, so you don't know what to say. I'm outnumbered, look at me, on stage. In any case, I think we want to know more about what is included in the MOU that was signed today. What is it that inspired PAFMA, and what can we expect out of PAFMA?
So I think to summarize what is in the MOU, and I'm speaking in my capacity as the chair of this newly formed body, is essentially a commitment to work together to strengthen our industry on a continental basis. Up until now, essentially, we have operated in a quite siloed manner where each country is doing what it thought was appropriate for it, and that's all well and good. But just speaking personally, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to work in 5 African countries in the asset management industry, and I've been quite frustrated when I saw something that worked well in one country, not being applied in another country. You'd engage key stakeholders, whether those be your clients or government, and it was hard for them to take on board your message. So I think once we formed a body like this, it becomes a much more credible way to put across things that one would take for granted. Let's talk about, for example, infrastructure funding and the fact that pension funds absolutely must play a critical role in funding that. Yet, in a number of our countries on the continent, they're very far from doing that, whilst others are well ahead of the curve on doing that. If you look at another thing, certain of our countries are more comfortable investing more money offshore, for whatever reason, and others are very reticent to do so. So I think having a credible body like PAFMA to serve as a very strong voice, I think will make it a lot easier for us to achieve the objectives that we see as important.
Thanks, Tapulogona. The question is, what should we expect at COP28 in relation to financing climate action projects?
So I think not much yet. So we were literally formed today. So I think a lot of the work that we need to do is getting ourselves organized in terms of, first of all, growing the membership. So there's 5 countries represented up here. We certainly want to have at least by 15 by the time COP comes to be. And we certainly recognize that the need for a cogent and coherent climate financing strategy on a continental basis is important. Obviously every country will have different ways of applying specific things that don't necessarily mirror what happens in another country. But in another respect, there are key points that we have all bought into as countries, and we need to drive that message as a singular body.
Thank you so much. It is therefore my greatest pleasure to announce the official launch of PAFMA, the Pan-African Fund Managers Association, and today they have already this morning signed the MOU. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors, and see you in COP.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. You are part of the solution. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. PPMC. Let us all rise, rise, Pambazuka. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. We are part of the solution. You are part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. You are part of the solution. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. Let us all rise, rise, Pambazuka. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. PPMC. Let us all rise, rise, Pambazuka. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. We are part of the solution. You are part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. We are part of the solution. You are part of the solution.
From north, south, east to the west, the beauty of Africa flows. We have all it takes to change the climate story and show ourselves in all our splendor and glory. Yeah. Let's come together now to bring down all barriers for a greater tomorrow. So
Part of the solution. We are part of the solution. I am part of the solution. You are part of the solution. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka. Let us all rise, rise, Pambazuka. Africa, rise, rise, Pambazuka.
Equator, you pay your boy. I can't get any help for your boy. Equator, you pay your boy. I knew the boy, Equator, you pay your boy. I knew the
Kenya, Kenya,